Letters from the Lighthouse. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The morning Emma Calloway drove into Harrow's Cove, she was running away from her life. She preferred to think of it as starting over, but somewhere between mile marker 47 and the first glimpse of the ocean shimmering through the pine trees, she'd stopped lying to herself. She was 35 years old, newly divorced, and the only thing left in her name was half a savings account and a bookstore she'd never seen, left to her by a great-aunt she'd met exactly twice. The Atlantic appeared between gaps in the coastal forest like something promised. Gray-blue and vast, it didn't care about her divorce decree or the empty apartment she'd left behind in Boston, or the way Marcus had looked at her across the kitchen table 6 months ago and said, "I think we've been strangers for years." The ocean simply was, enormous and indifferent, and somehow exactly what she needed. Harrow's Cove announced itself with a hand-painted wooden sign. Population 1,847. Welcome, friend. Someone had added a small painted seagull in the corner, its wing lifted as if waving. Emma almost smiled. The town unfolded along the coastline like something from a postcard somebody had kept too long. Salt-weathered storefronts, a harbor packed with fishing boats rocking in the morning tide, window boxes full of late-season geraniums. Strings of white lights looped between lampposts on the main street, though it was barely 9 in the morning. She suspected they kept them up year-round here, the kind of town that believed there was no wrong season for a little warmth. She found Calloway's Books on Merchant Street, sandwiched between a bakery called The Anchor and Crumb and a small post office with a rusted weather vane on its roof shaped like a whale. The bookstore's window was dark, its sign faded to a gentle, sun-bleached blue. A closed notice hung slightly crooked on the door. Emma sat in her parked car for a long moment, looking at it. Her great-aunt, Agnes Calloway, Aunt Aggie, her father had called her, the eccentric one, the one who never left Harrow's Cove while the rest of the family scattered across the country, had run this bookstore for over 40 years. She'd died in February, quietly, in the apartment above the shop. The lawyer's letter said she'd left everything to Emma, along with a single handwritten note tucked into the envelope. "You always had her eyes. She would have wanted you to have it. Don't sell it to strangers." Emma still wasn't sure who she referred to. She'd meant to ask. Then Marcus had come home, with the look on his face, and everything else had collapsed around that moment. And by the time she'd surfaced again, it seemed too late to ask anyone. She took a breath that tasted of salt and possibility, grabbed the old iron key the lawyer had mailed her, and stepped out of the car. The inside of Calloway's Books smelled the way all good bookstores do, of paper aging gracefully, of dust that had settled into something almost sweet, of stories sleeping on their shelves. Emma stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, packed in that slightly chaotic way that spoke of a person who knew exactly where everything was, even if no one else did. A small reading nook occupied the front window, cushioned in faded navy blue. A wooden ladder on a brass rail leaned against the far wall. There was a wood stove in the corner, iron black and cold now, a tin kettle on top of it. It was, Emma thought, someone's whole life packed into a room. She spent the morning doing a slow inventory, not of books, not yet, but of things. The life her great-aunt had lived here. Framed photos on the back wall showed Harrow's Cove through the decades, boats and storms and festivals, ordinary days that had accumulated into something. In one photo, a young woman in a yellow dress stood in front of this very store, laughing at something off camera. On the back, in a spidery hand, Agnes, 1974. Her first summer. Emma studied the photograph for a long time before setting it back. It was the smell that led her to the attic. A sweetness beneath the mustiness, like dried lavender and something else she couldn't name. A pull-down staircase in the small back hallway had a rope handle, and when she tugged it, a rectangle of dusty light opened above her. The attic was low-ceilinged and full of the gentle disorder of decades. Boxes, a broken rocking chair, a dress form wearing a string of pearls, old framed prints stacked against the beams, and in the corner, beneath a slant of light from a small hexagonal window, a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, painted deep green and tied with a length of faded ribbon. Emma carried it downstairs, set it on the counter, and untied the ribbon carefully, carried it inside, bundled with a second piece of ribbon, and stacked with the precision of something very deliberately preserved, were the letters. 31 of them, all sealed, all addressed in the same careful, slanted handwriting, all stamped and ready to be mailed. None of them had ever been sent. The name on the return address read simply, G. Harrow, Lighthouse Road, Harrow's Cove. The name on the front of every single envelope was the same. Agnes. Emma's hand stilled on the paper. She looked up at the photograph on the wall. The young woman in the yellow dress, laughing her summer laugh. Agnes, 1974. She looked back down at the top envelope. The postmark on the stamp, never canceled, never mailed, read the same year. 1974. Emma sat down slowly on the stool behind the counter, the box in her lap, the weight of 31 unsent love letters resting against her palms, and felt something shift in the room, as if the bookstore had been waiting all these years for someone to find this box. As if Agnes had been waiting too. Outside, the ocean light shifted, and the town went about its ordinary September morning, and Emma Calloway, running away, starting over, not yet sure which, began, very carefully, to read. She read only the first letter that day. It felt wrong to read them all at once, like rushing through something sacred. But that first letter stayed with her all evening as she unpacked boxes in the small apartment upstairs, as she heated soup on the narrow stove and listened to the sound of the ocean she could hear even through the walls. Agnes, it began. I have started this letter 11 times. I keep getting to the part where I tell you what I feel and losing my nerve entirely. I am not a man who speaks easily of such things. You know this. You have always known this better than I knew it about myself. But I am trying. I am trying very hard. It was signed, Yours, if you'll have me, George. Emma set the letter down on her kitchen table and pressed her fingers against her sternum, where something ached. She didn't know if it was the letter or her own life she was feeling. Maybe both. Maybe that was the thing about other people's love stories. They held a mirror up to your own in ways you didn't always expect. She fell asleep that night to the sound of waves, the first letter on the table beside her empty soup bowl, and dreamed, unexpectedly, of lighthouses. She woke up wanting to know what happened to George. Chapter 2. The Lighthouse Keeper. The lighthouse stood at the far end of the northern point, visible from almost anywhere in town if you looked in the right direction. A white tower striped with a single band of black, rising from a small island of rock just off the mainland, connected by a narrow stone causeway. Emma could see it from the bookstore window if she pressed her cheek against the glass and angled just right. She found herself doing this more than made sense. She'd asked about it at the bakery on her second morning in town, when she'd gone in for coffee and one of the enormous blueberry scones that she'd already decided would be her primary food group in Harrow's Cove. The woman behind the counter, Patrice, mid-60s, white-streaked hair pinned back, the kind of face that had seen everything twice, had set down her coffee cup and given Emma a considering look. "Harrow Point Light," Patrice said. "Still operational. Coast Guard maintains it officially, but there's a keeper lives out there." She paused. "His name's Daniel Harrow." Emma kept her face carefully neutral. "Harrow? Like the town?" "His family founded it." Patrice picked up her coffee cup again, a study in casual. "Been keepers of that light for 5 generations. Daniel's the last one." Another pause, freighted with something Emma couldn't quite read. "He's private. Doesn't come into town much." Emma nodded slowly. "Good to know." She brought her scone back to the bookstore, sat in the reading nook with the second letter, and read about a man named George Harrow, who had apparently been terrible at saying the things he meant and wonderful at writing them down. She didn't plan to go to the Lighthouse. She planned, in fact, to be methodical and sensible, to research first, to ask around quietly, to understand the full shape of the story before she showed up on anyone's doorstep holding a box of their grandfather's love letters. She lasted 4 days. The 4th evening, she walked. The causeway was long enough that she could change her mind 3 times before she reached the other side. And she almost did. Twice. The tide was going out, leaving wet, dark rock on either side of the path, and the sky above the water had gone that particular shade of late September gold that seemed designed specifically to make people do things they'd been hesitating about. The lighthouse was bigger up close than it looked from town. The keeper's cottage sat at its base, stone walls, a red door, a small kitchen garden that had gone a little wild with end-of-season abundance. Kale, she thought, and something else. The light itself revolved at the top of the tower, its beams still cutting across the water even in the daylight, patient and reliable. Emma knocked on the red door. Nothing. Then footsteps. The man who opened the door was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she'd expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with dark hair that was a little too long, and the kind of face that suggested it had spent considerable time outdoors and in difficult weather. He wore a gray wool sweater and looked at her with dark eyes that were careful and not unfriendly, but measuring. "Can I help you?" His voice was low and even, the kind that sounded like it didn't raise often. "I'm Emma Calloway," she said. "I've taken over the bookstore in town. Agnes Calloway was my great-aunt." Something moved across his face. Not quite emotion, more like the shadow of it. "I heard someone had come," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "I didn't know her well," Emma admitted. "That's actually part of why I'm here." She hesitated, then made the decision she'd been turning over for 4 days. "I found something in the bookstore. Some letters. They were addressed to my aunt, and the return address is this lighthouse." She watched his face. "From someone named George Harrow." The silence that followed was long enough for the revolving light above them to complete a full turn. "That would be my grandfather," Daniel Harrow said finally. His jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "You'd better come in." The cottage was spare and warm, full of books. She noticed that first, relieved by it, the way you're relieved to find something familiar in an unfamiliar place. They lined the walls of the main room, stacked on the low wooden coffee table, piled beside the deep armchair nearest the wood stove. Navigation charts were pinned to one wall alongside pencil sketches of the coastline. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter. She took the chair he indicated, and he took the one across from her. And there was a moment where neither of them spoke, the fire ticking quietly between them. "He wrote to her," Daniel said. It wasn't quite a question. 31 letters. Emma said. All of them sealed. None of them mailed. She hesitated. I only read the first one. It seemed... I wanted to ask before I read any more. They're yours, really. Your family's. Daniel looked at the fire. Yours. My grandfather died when I was 12. He never talked about her, about Agnes. He picked up his tea, didn't drink it. My father mentioned her once, when I was maybe 20. Said his father had loved a woman before he married my grandmother, and it had ended badly, and he never really got over it. He said it like a warning. A warning about what? Daniel's eyes came back to her. They were darker up close, complicated. About loving someone you can't hold on to, he said simply. Emma thought, without wanting to, about Marcus. About the kitchen table and the stranger's comment, and the year leading up to it. The slow, quiet erosion of two people who had stopped trying at the same time, without either of them quite admitting it. I'd like to read them, Daniel said, if that's all right. They're yours to read. Emma stood and then paused. Can I ask you something? Do you know what happened between them? Between your grandfather and Agnes? Daniel Harrow looked at her with those careful, complicated eyes. No, he said. I don't think anyone does. Emma looked around the cottage. The books, the charts, the life of a man who had chosen this small island of rock and light as his whole world. Maybe the letters will tell us, she said. She left the box with him. She walked back across the causeway with the last of the golden light behind her. And she didn't know why it felt, very faintly, like leaving something behind. Chapter 3. What the Letters Said. She was refiling a section of local history when the bell above the bookstore door rang and Daniel Harrow walked in. It was 10 days after her visit to the Lighthouse. She had not expected to hear from him. She'd told herself firmly that she had not been waiting. The bookstore had kept her busy. She'd been cleaning and cataloging and quietly falling in love with the place. The particular way the autumn light came through the front window in the afternoons. The smell of old paper that she was starting to think of as something close to home. She'd also read the second letter, and then the third. She'd told herself she was reading them because they were history, because they were part of understanding the store and her inheritance. She told herself this very firmly. By the seventh letter, she'd stopped telling herself anything and just sat in the reading nook with her tea and read. Because George Harrow had been a man who, once he'd started writing what he felt, apparently could not stop. And what he wrote was the kind of thing you couldn't not read. He'd loved Agnes Calloway, with the kind of love that had terrified him. She'd come to town in the summer of 1974, newly moved from Portland with her boxes of books and her stubborn dream. And George, 26, already keeper of his family's lighthouse, already certain he knew the shape his life would take, had fallen off the edge of himself entirely. I think about what you said yesterday, he wrote in the fourth letter, about whether it's braver to stay or to go. I have always thought staying was the braver thing. Harrow men stay. That is the whole of our history. But when you say it, I can't tell anymore if staying is courage or only the absence of imagination. Emma had read that line 4 times. Now Daniel was standing in her bookstore, and he had the green box tucked under his arm, and he looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. I read them, he said. Emma nodded carefully. All of them? All of them. He set the box on the counter between them. She loved him back. She wrote in some of them, in the margins, in pencil, in back, responding to things he said, like she was having a conversation with letters she never received. He paused. I think she found this box, Emma, sometime much later, after he'd died. She found the letters and read them all, and wrote back in the margins to a man who was already gone. Emma's hand went to the box lid. I didn't see that, she said quietly. It's in the later ones. His voice was rough at the edges. She wrote that she never understood why he stopped. He wrote through August and September, and then nothing. She thought he'd stopped loving her. What happened? Daniel's jaw worked. My great-grandmother, Margaret. She was already in love with my grandfather in the summer of 1974, and when she found out about Agnes, she went to Agnes's bookstore. I don't know exactly what she said, but Agnes left Harrow's Cove in October of that year and didn't come back for almost 2 years. He paused. And by then, my grandfather had married Margaret. Emma sat down slowly on the stool. He thought Agnes left because she didn't want him. And she thought he'd stopped writing because he'd chosen someone else. Daniel's expression was bleak and tired. They spent 50 years in the same small town, loving each other from a distance, probably both thinking the other one had given up. He rubbed a hand over his face. My grandfather kept every letter he'd written and never sent. My grandmother knew. She had to have known. He stopped. I don't know what to do with any of that. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think Agnes kept the store because of him. I think she stayed in Harrow's Cove all her life, partly because it was the place where he was. She looked at the photographs on the wall. That's not entirely sad, is it? They shared a town. They probably saw each other at the harbor, at the bakery, at the festivals. They shared this place they both loved, even if they couldn't share everything. Daniel looked at the photographs too, at Agnes in her yellow dress. He used to take a long walk every Sunday morning, he said slowly, as if remembering something. Up Merchant Street and back. My father mentioned it once, said it was like a ritual, even when he was very old. He stopped. Merchant Street, Emma said softly. Where the bookstore was. Where Agnes had spent every Sunday morning of her adult life behind these windows, reading. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The October wind pressed against the storefront windows, and the smell of the sea came through the old frame, and Emma felt the weight of 50 years of missed chances settle into the room like something gentle and irreversible. She left you the store, Daniel said finally. Yes. Why you? She had other family. Emma shook her head slowly. I don't know. The lawyer's note said she would have wanted me to have it. She, not Agnes, someone else. She looked up at him. Agnes, I've been trying to figure out who she meant. Daniel was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Careful, still, but something warmer underneath it, like a light seen through water. Have you eaten? He asked. The question was so unexpected that Emma actually laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her. Not since this morning, she admitted. There's a place on the harbor, he said. Fish chowder. It's good. Emma looked at the green box, at the letters. Okay, she said. Yes. Chapter 4. Chowder and Carefully Kept Distances. They walked to the harbor in the late afternoon dark, October having made its intentions clear. Daniel walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and the particular ease of a man who was entirely comfortable in wind and weather. Emma discovered that she could keep up with his long stride if she didn't think too hard about it, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't want to walk slower. And the restaurant was called The Buoy, and it smelled of brine and butter and decades of fish chowder. And the woman who ran it, May, apparently, of the general consensus that everyone in Harrow's Cove had one strong opinion and would share it freely, greeted Daniel with the kind of warm directness that suggested she considered his hermit tendencies a personal affront. You're alive, May said flatly. Good. And you've brought the new bookstore girl. Emma offered. I know who you are. Agnes talked about you. May set 2 water glasses down with authority. Said you had your great-great-grandmother Catherine's eyes. Said she always meant to write to you, but couldn't figure out how to start. Emma stared at her. Catherine? Old Kate Calloway. Founded this town alongside the Harrows, back before anyone can properly remember. First bookstore was hers. May looked at Emma with something that was almost a smile. Agnes was the last of that line. I suppose now you are. She left them with menus they didn't really need. Emma looked across the table at Daniel. She. In the lawyer's note? Agnes meant Catherine. Daniel nodded slowly. My grandfather used to say that Harrows and Calloways had been bound up with each other since the beginning of this place. He said it like it was just a fact about the town. Maybe it is, Emma said. The chowder arrived. It was extraordinary. Cream and potato and clam with a sweetness underneath that Emma couldn't identify and decided she didn't need to. And they ate in a comfortable silence for a few minutes that wasn't awkward so much as easy, which surprised Emma more than the silence itself would have. Can I ask what brought you here? Daniel said. Beyond the inheritance. Emma looked at her bowl. The honest answer felt large, the way things did when you'd been carrying them a while. A divorce, she said. Finalized in July. The store came at a good time for needing somewhere to go. He didn't offer the usual condolences, which she appreciated. He just nodded, once, as if filing it away. I'm sorry it happened, he said simply. I'm not sure I am anymore, Emma admitted. I think I was sad for the right reasons, for the years and the hope and the person I'd thought we were going to be. But not for the actual marriage. At some point, we stopped being kind to each other and started just being present, in the same house. It's a strange thing to grieve. Grieving something you'd already lost while you still had it. Exactly that. She looked at him. You understand that. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite closing, but careful. I was engaged, he said. 7 years ago. She lived in Portland. She wanted me to leave the Lighthouse. He paused. I thought I could want what she wanted if I tried hard enough. I couldn't. Did you try? For 2 years. The word was flat and final. The Lighthouse isn't a job to me. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound strange, Emma said honestly. It sounds like you knew yourself. Or like I was too stubborn. Maybe both things can be true. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. Maybe, he said. Outside, the harbor lights reflected in the black water, and the wind moved through the rigging of the docked boats in a sound like low music. Emma thought about Agnes sitting in her bookstore window on Sunday mornings, and George walking up Merchant Street, and all the miles of distance that people put between themselves and the things they wanted most. I'm staying, she said, though he hadn't asked. In Harrow's Cove. I think I'm going to run the bookstore. She paused. I haven't told anyone that yet, actually. I just decided. Daniel looked at her across the table in the low, golden light of the restaurant. Good, he said. Just that, just good. But something in the way he said it made Emma look at her chowder so he wouldn't see the color in her face. Chapter 5. The Storm. November came in hard. The town pulled itself tighter against the weather. Storm shutters went up, boats came in off their moorings, and the bakery switched from iced coffee to mulled cider with the decisiveness of a military operation. Emma had gotten the wood stove in the bookstore working, which turned out to involve considerable help from a retired fisherman named Carl who lived 3 doors down and had opinions about flue pipes. She was developing a deep appreciation for a town where people showed up uninvited with the right tool for the job. She had also, in the past month, cataloged the entire bookstore inventory, repainted the front window trim a deep teal that made Patrice at the bakery raise an eyebrow and then grudgingly approve, and begun a correspondence with a book wholesaler in Portland about restocking. She had not been to the Lighthouse. Daniel had come to the store 3 times, once to bring back the green box, which he'd handed over with a slightly awkward gravity, as if returning something borrowed and important. Once to drop off a navigation chart, a very old one, hand-drawn, which he'd found in his grandfather's things and thought the bookstore should have, since it was one of only 2 extant maps showing the original layout of Harrow's Cove Harbor. And once, on a Tuesday afternoon, apparently for no reason, who had stood in the fiction section for 20 minutes and left with a novel by a Norwegian author Emma had recommended, and had said, on his way out, that it was cold enough to snow. She'd thought about him more than she would have liked, about the way he said things simply and meant them, about the careful quality of his attention, things about the fact that he had chosen a small island of rock and light over a life that would have been larger and easier, and seemed genuinely at peace with that choice. She was not developing feelings for Daniel Harrow. She was being cautious. There was a difference. The storm hit on a Friday. The forecast had been ominous since Wednesday. The first real nor'easter of the season, the weather service said, with the particular cheerfulness of meteorologists delivering bad news. Emma had bought candles and extra firewood and soup ingredients and was feeling moderately prepared when the storm actually arrived and reminded her that weather on the New England coast operated on a completely different scale than anything she'd experienced in the city. The wind came first, and then the rain. And then the rain became something more horizontal and forceful, and the power went out at 7:30 in the evening. Emma lit candles and fed the wood stove and sat in the reading nook with the Norwegian novel and told herself she was fine. She was fine. She was warm and dry, and the bookstore held against the storm with the stubborn solidity of its century-old walls, and she was absolutely fine. At 9 o'clock, her phone rang, a local number she hadn't saved. "It's Daniel." His voice was even, but with something taut underneath it. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Power's out, but the stove is going. Are you—" She realized, suddenly, the scale of what the storm would be like at the Lighthouse. At the end of that narrow causeway, on that exposed point of rock, with the sea running at whatever the sea ran at in a nor'easter. "Are you all right?" "Yes, the light's running, the cottage is solid. I've ridden out worse." A pause. "I wanted to make sure you were settled. First big storm." "You called to check on me." "I was passing the phone anyway." Emma smiled at the dark window, rain streaming down it in silver sheets. "Thank you. I'm genuinely fine, though I may be reading by candlelight until morning." "What are you reading?" "The Norwegian novel." "Any good?" "Devastating," she said. "In a very good way." Another pause, comfortable this time. "There's a storm protocol in the store," he said. "My grandfather wrote it up, apparently, back when Agnes first opened. It's probably in the desk somewhere, if you want to feel official about it." Emma looked at the old wooden desk in the back. "There's a storm protocol." "For the bookstore. In case of flooding or damage, which shelves to prioritize moving, that kind of thing." She could hear the wind on his end of the phone, a different pitch than what she was hearing, rawer, wilder. He took the bookstore seriously. He took Agnes seriously. "Yes," Daniel said quietly. He did. They stayed on the phone for another hour quietly. Emma read him a passage from the Norwegian novel that she thought he'd appreciate. He told her about a storm 5 years ago that had taken out the causeway for 3 days, leaving him entirely cut off. He'd described it without drama, as a fact of the life he'd chosen. But there was something in his voice when he talked about those 3 days. A solitude deeper than ordinary solitude. The kind you could only find on a rock in the North Atlantic with a lighthouse turning above you in the dark. "Did you mind it?" she asked. "Being that cut off?" A long pause. "No," he said. "And yes. I don't mind being alone. I mind being alone and knowing that other people are—" He stopped. "I mind knowing there are people somewhere who might be concerned." Emma held the phone and listened to the storm, and thought about that. "I would have been concerned," she said, and surprised herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "If I'd known you then." The line was quiet for a beat. "Good night, Emma," Daniel said, and his voice had gone gentle in a way she filed away carefully and didn't quite look at directly. "Good night," she said. She sat for a while after they hung up, candle burning on the windowsill, storm pressing at the glass, and tried to remember the last time she'd talked to someone for an hour about nothing in particular, and felt, at the end of it, more settled rather than less. It had been a long time. Chapter 6. What Was Always There. The letter she found on the 28th day of November was not in the green box. She found it between the pages of a copy of Rebecca, the 1963 edition, cloth-bound, shelved in the fiction section between two books that shouldn't logically have had a gap. She pulled it out when she was reorganizing the section, and a thin envelope slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. It was addressed to her. Not to Agnes, not to George. It to her. To Emma Calloway, in handwriting that was older and shakier than the letters in the box, but recognizable as the same hand, the same careful slant. She sat down on the floor of the bookstore between two shelves and opened it. "Dear Emma," Agnes had written. "If you are reading this, then you have found the store and the box, and perhaps more than that. You are always clever, even as a little girl. You had Catherine's eyes. Everyone in our family knew it, though we didn't speak of it because we were all very bad at speaking of things. It seems to run in the blood. I am leaving you the store because it needs someone who will love it, not preserve it, love it. There is a difference. I am also leaving it to you because I think you might need it, or something like it, a place to land. I have been watching your life from a careful distance for years, the way old women sometimes watch the young women they see themselves in, and I have wanted to write to you many times. Women I kept not starting. I have a talent for not starting things. The letters in the green box belong to George Harrow's family now. Give them to his grandson, if he is still there. Tell him that I did not leave because I stopped caring. Tell him that I understood, eventually, why his grandfather made the choice he made, and I forgave him a long time ago. I hope he forgave me too, wherever he is. I like to think we were good company for each other across the years, even at a distance. I liked knowing he was there. I think he liked knowing I was here. Don't make our mistake, Emma. Not the same one. You will know what I mean when the time comes. With all my love, Agnes." Emma sat on the floor of the bookstore for a long time. Rain tapped quietly at the window. The wood stove ticked. Somewhere outside, a gull cried once and was gone. She thought about what it meant to love someone from across a town for 50 years and call it enough, because the alternative was too frightening. She thought about Marcus and the kitchen table. She thought about the careful distances she'd been keeping, out of caution or habit or the reasonable fear of someone who had walked away from wreckage and didn't entirely trust herself to identify solid ground yet. She thought about Daniel Harrow, on his island in the sea, who had chosen solitude not because he didn't feel things, but because he felt them with a precision that required careful handling, who had called her in a storm just to make sure she was all right, who came to the bookstore on Tuesdays for reasons neither of them examined. She folded Agnes's letter and put it in her pocket. Then she put on her coat. The causeway in the rain was cold and silver gray, and Emma walked it with her hands in her pockets and the letter against her hip, and the feeling that she was doing something that couldn't be undone, which was either frightening or exactly the point. She knocked on the red door. Daniel answered in a flannel shirt and bare feet, which for some reason made him look more human and more approachable, and he looked at her standing in the rain with an expression that moved through surprise and something careful and something else she couldn't entirely name. "Emma." "Agnes left me a letter," she said. "I need to tell you what it says." He held the door wider, and she came in out of the rain. She told him everything. He sat in his armchair with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't asked for and he had simply made, and he listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, with that quality of attention that felt like being taken seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "She forgave him," he said finally. "She said she understood." Those were her words. Daniel set his mug down carefully. "I've been angry," he said, in a tone that suggested he hadn't quite planned to say this. "At my grandmother. At what she did to both of them. I've been carrying that since I read the letters." "It was a cruel thing to do." "Yes." He paused. "But she loved him too. That doesn't excuse it, but she loved him and she was afraid of losing him, and she made a terrible choice from fear." He looked at his hands. "I understand that more than I'd like to." Emma thought about his engagement, the woman in Portland, the 2 years of trying to want what someone else wanted because he was afraid of what it would mean to choose differently. "She also said," Emma said carefully, "don't make our mistake." The fire was low, and the rain on the lighthouse tower made a sound like time passing. Daniel looked at her across the small, warm room, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. "I know what she meant," he said. "So do I." "Emma." He said her name the way you'd handle something fragile. "I should tell you that I am not easy. I know that about myself. I am a man who lives on a rock in the ocean and has strong opinions about navigation charts, and tends to show up at your bookstore on Tuesdays for no stated reason because—" He stopped. "Because I like seeing you," he said simply. I wanted to say that plainly, since we're being plain. Emma's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. "I like seeing you too. I think you know that." I wasn't sure. He looked at her with those careful, honest eyes. "You're recently divorced, yes, I know." She took a breath. "I'm not fragile. I was, for a while, and now I'm not. I moved to a new town and learned to operate a 19th century wood stove and read 50-year-old love letters and refiled an entire mystery section, and I think that establishes that I am doing all right." The corner of his mouth curved. The mystery section needed it. It was a crisis. "Emma," he said again, and this time it was different. Warmer, the careful quality still there, but softer underneath it. "I don't want to be fast about this. I'm not a fast person. I'm not fast either, she said. I'm a person who drove away from a 10-year marriage at 7 in the morning with her car full of books. I'm not in a hurry. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Have dinner with me. Sunday. Here, I'll cook." "You cook?" "I live alone on the Lighthouse. I've had considerable practice." Emma laughed, and it was the good kind again, the kind that started somewhere real. "Sunday," she said. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc through the rainy dark. And below it, the cottage was warm and lit, and the ocean did what it had always done, moved and shifted and held its ancient tides. And Emma Calloway thought that landing, when you finally did it, felt less like stopping and more like arriving. Chapter 7. December Light. December in Harrow's Cove was a kind of magic that Emma suspected the town was entirely aware of and delighted in. The strings of white lights that had been up since before she arrived took on a new significance. The harbor glittered. Wood smoke hung in the cold air along Merchant Street. The bakery began selling something called a Lighthouse loaf that was a dense, sweet bread with dried cranberries and cardamom, and Emma bought one every Friday and ate half immediately and brought the other half to Daniel on Saturdays. The Sundays became a ritual. Daniel cooked well, simply, with the focused attention he gave to everything, using fish from the harbor and vegetables he apparently grew even in November in his cottage garden, with a stubbornness she found admirable. She brought wine, and they ate at the small kitchen table, and afterward they walked the causeway back toward town if the weather allowed, and stood at the midpoint looking out at the water together, close enough that their shoulders touched, neither of them moving away. They talked about everything and around some things. They told each other about their lives with the gradual generosity of people who had learned, through experience, to be careful. He told her about growing up in this town with the lighthouse as a fixed point, about his father who had kept the light before him, and his grandfather who had kept it before that. She told him about Boston, about the marriage, about the specific flavor of loneliness that comes from being lonely inside a relationship, the particular grief of that. He listened. He always listened. "You never felt like that?" she asked him once. "That loneliness?" "Not in a relationship," he said. "I ended things before they got that far, when I could see where they were going." He paused. "Which is its own kind of cowardice, I think. Different shape, same root." Emma looked at the water. "What's the root?" "Fear that what you have to offer isn't enough." He said it plainly, without drama. That the life you've built is too small, or too strange, or too bounded. That someone will want you to be something else, and you'll have to choose. "I don't want you to be something else," Emma said. She hadn't meant to say it quite like that. It came out simply, the way true things sometimes do when you're not bracing yourself. Daniel was very still for a moment. Then he turned, and he looked at her, and something in his face had changed, had opened, gently, like a room with the windows unlocked for the first time in years. "I know," he said quietly. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, a touch so careful it made her breath catch. She tilted her face toward his hand without thinking, the way a plant moves toward light, and he saw her do it, and his expression did something that made her heart feel too large for her chest. He kissed her gently, on the stone causeway with the winter sea on both sides, the lighthouse behind them, and the town lights ahead. It was the kind of kiss that is asking a question and knows the answer already. When he pulled back, he kept his forehead against hers for a moment, and they stayed like that in the cold air, and Emma could feel him smiling. "Finally," she heard herself say. He laughed, A real laugh, warm and surprised, and she felt it against her face and thought that she would like to spend a considerable amount of time making that laugh happen. It was Patrice at the bakery who told her, 12 days before Christmas, with the gravity of someone delivering important news. "Margaret Harrow's letters," Patrice said, setting a coffee on the counter. "Agnes found them. A long time ago, I want to say the late 90s? She found letters Margaret had written to George, confessing what she'd done, sending Agnes away on a lie." She paused. "Agnes told me, in one of those late evening conversations when you say things you'd never say in daylight. She'd forgiven Margaret by then. She said Margaret had spent her whole marriage in guilt and George had never known why Agnes really left." Patrice looked at Emma steadily. Agnes could have told him. She chose not to. Instead, she thought it was too late to undo. And she told me she thought, that blowing up 50 years of his life with her truth would have been selfish. Emma stood very still. She protected him. She loved him, Patrice said simply. That was what that looked like, for her. She put a blueberry scone on the counter beside the coffee. "I thought you should know the whole of it. You and Daniel." Emma walked back to the bookstore slowly, thinking about love and its shapes, the way it looked like patience in one person and sacrifice in another, the way it sometimes looked like a man walking up Merchant Street every Sunday morning for 50 years, and a woman in a bookstore window who happened to be there. She told Daniel that evening, sitting in the reading nook with the wood stove going and the snow that had started falling softly beyond the window. He listened. He was quiet afterward for a long time. "She was remarkable," he said finally. Not sad, admiring. "Remarkable." "She was," Emma agreed. "I want to do something for her." He looked around the bookstore. Something that acknowledges what she was, who she was. He paused and then, "The letters. I think they should be here. In the store. Not displayed, just kept here. Where she kept them. Where she found them." Emma nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same thing." "And I thought—" He stopped, uncertain, which was rare enough that she looked at him closely. "There's an event. In February. The town does a historical evening. Local history, family histories, that kind of thing. I thought perhaps we could tell their story. George and Agnes. Properly." He looked at the photographs on the wall. "I think they'd have wanted people to know." Emma thought about Agnes in her yellow dress, laughing in the summer of 1974. About George Harrow, writing letters he never sent, walking up Merchant Street for 50 years. "Yes," she said. "I think they would." Outside the bookstore window, Harrow's Cove glittered in the December dark, and the lighthouse beam traced its wide arc over the water, as patient and reliable as it had always been. Chapter 8. What Lasts. February came soft, which Patrice said was unusual. A winter that had made itself felt now loosened its grip with something almost like apology. Mild days, skies the pale, clean blue of water in a glass. The first harbingers of crocus working their way through the softening ground around the bookstore step. Emma had repainted the interior of Calloway's books over the winter. Not dramatically. She wasn't that brave yet. Or maybe she was exactly that brave and didn't want to overdo it. The walls were now the color of aged cream, and she'd found an old maritime map that she'd had framed and hung behind the counter. She'd sourced a new reading chair for the nook, deeper, wider, in a blue-green that matched the repainted trim. She'd set up a small event space in the back, 3 rows of folding chairs she'd found in the attic, alongside a card table that became, under a tablecloth, a perfectly respectable refreshment station. She had also, without quite deciding to, settled into Harrow's Cove in the way that feels less like a choice and more like recognition. She knew which table at the restaurant was warmest in cold weather. She knew that Carl from down the street would bring her fish on Thursdays if she texted him in the morning, and that Patrice took her coffee with honey and expected you to know this. She had joined the library board, which mostly met to drink Patrice's coffee and debate whether romance novels should have their own section. Emma's position? Obviously yes, decisively so. She knew that Daniel's truck made a particular sound when it turned from the Harbor Road onto Merchant Street. She knew that he came in on Tuesdays still, and now sometimes on Fridays, and that when he was in the store, he had a habit of reading the first page of every book he considered buying before committing, which she found both maddening and entirely characteristic. She knew the sound of his voice in the morning and the way he held his coffee mug with both hands in cold weather. She knew that he was falling in love with her, in the deliberate, wholehearted, irreversible way of a man who doesn't do things partially, and that she was falling in love with him in exactly the same way. It was, she thought, the best kind of terror. The evening event was a Friday in mid-February, and more people came than Emma had expected. The bookstore held 40 of them comfortably, with a few more crowded near the door and the back wall, and the town turned out with the collective willingness to be moved that, Emma had discovered, was one of Harrow's Cove's finest qualities. That she stood near the wood stove while Daniel spoke, because she had refused to be at the podium for this part. The story of George and Agnes belonged to him, and he told it without notes, simply and clearly, the way he told everything. He had brought one of the letters. With her permission and Agnes's absence to give it, he read aloud from the 8th letter, which was the one Emma had always found hardest. The one where George wrote that he was afraid the summer was ending and he hadn't said what needed to be said, and that he was afraid of what it would mean to say it, and more afraid of what it would mean not to. I am a man of this coast, George had written. I know how to weather a storm. What I don't know, Agnes, is how to weather the possibility of a life without you in it. I am trying to learn. I am not succeeding. The room was very quiet. Daniel folded the letter. They spent 50 years in this town, he said, loving each other and not saying so, for reasons that seemed like the right ones at the time. My grandfather wrote 31 letters and didn't send any of them. Agnes found them after he was gone and wrote back in the margins. He paused. We'll never know everything that happened between them, but we know what's in the letters, and we know that they both stayed, in this town, in this community, within sight of each other, for the whole of their lives. I think that was its own kind of love story, quieter than most, but real. He looked at Emma across the crowded room. She looked back at him and felt something settle in her chest, solid and warm, like a stone that has been in the sun all day. The letters are staying in Calloway's books, he said. Agnes left the store to the right person. A beat. I think most of you know her by now. There was a kind of soft sound from the room. Not applause, something warmer than that. The collective exhalation of a community that had been watching two people carefully all winter and had opinions about how it was going. Emma did not look away from Daniel's eyes. Afterward, when the crowd had gradually thinned and the wine was gone, and Patrice had swept away the remaining refreshments with characteristic efficiency, Emma and Daniel stood alone in the bookstore among the empty chairs and the candles burning low and the green box on the shelf behind the counter where it lived now, in its permanent place between a copy of Rebecca and a collection of maritime poetry. You did well, Emma said. You should have been up there with me. This is your family's story. It's Calloway's books, he said. It's both of ours story. She looked at him in the candlelight. This man she had found at the end of a narrow causeway in a season when she had needed something solid to walk toward. and thought about beginnings. The ones you plan and the ones that find you. "I'm staying," she said, in case that wasn't clear. "Permanently. I filed the business paperwork last week." Something moved through his face. Relief and something deeper, a warmth that wasn't quite contained. "Good," he said, just as he'd said it the first time, in a restaurant smelling of fish chowder. And this time, she didn't look at her plate. "Agnes said don't make her mistake," Emma said. "And I've been thinking about what that means. What I want it to mean." She took a breath. "I don't want to be careful from a distance. I'm done with careful distances." Daniel moved toward her with the slowness of someone who has made a decision and intends to be sure about it. And he took her face in both hands with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And he kissed her in the low, warm light of Calloway's books, with the sound of Harrow's Cove settling into its winter night around them. When they separated, his forehead was against hers again, and she could feel him breathing. "Stay for a while," she said. "I'll make tea." "I'll stay," he said, "for as long as you want." Epilogue. In March, Emma found a photograph she hadn't seen before, tucked behind the maritime map she'd hung over the counter, slipped between the frame and the backing, preserved by the darkness for who knows how long. It showed two people on the causeway to the lighthouse. A young woman in a yellow dress, laughing, a tall man beside her, not quite smiling, but with his shoulder touching hers and his face turned toward her with an expression that was unmistakable even across the decades. On the back, in Agnes's handwriting, a single line. "The best day. July, 1974. Emma stood a long time looking at it. Then she walked to the door, flipped the bookstore sign to open, and texted Daniel. "Found something. Come when you can." She put the kettle on the wood stove, and the morning light came through the teal-framed window, and the lighthouse stood on its point of rock and turned its patient beam across the February brightening sea, and Harrow's Cove went about its ordinary, extraordinary morning life. And everything was, in the best possible sense, exactly as it should be. His reply came while the kettle was heating. "On my way." She smiled and put out 2 cups and waited. End.